One of the big advantages of being a blacksmith is that we get to make a lot of our own tools. We don't have to rely on some manufacturer anticipating exactly what we need and then having to settle on what they thought we needed that really isn't what we wanted. We can do a lot of this ourselves. And it's often said that if you have a forge, hammer, and anvil, you can make everything else. That's a little oversimplified because you do need other tools to make tools. You need a way to cut material, you need a way to dress hammers and punches and chisels. The hacksaws, files, things like that come in awfully handy, and you pretty much need those from day one in the blacksmith shop unless you have somebody else cut all your material for you and take them somewhere else to grind them. And if you have friends with other tools, sometimes that comes in quite handy. But the subject of tongs comes up quite regularly. It is probably the #1 requested video that I have, and I have not done a video on tongs yet. So I thought I would address tong making, because tongs are something you will use almost from the first day in the blacksmith shop. You'll find uses for tongs. But tongs are one of those tools that are hard to make without a pair of tongs. It's one of those catch-22s we run into in the world that if you have tongs, they're easier to make the next pair of tongs. So I'm going to look at a way of making tongs that does not require tongs. We're going to do them kind of backwards from the way you would typically do them. And hopefully in that way we can accomplish a good, useful pair of tongs that are fairly simple to build and within the range of most beginners without needing another pair of tongs. Now, what other tools will we need when we do that? You'll need to be able to put a hole in the tongs. Putting a rivet in is a requirement. You will have to either have a drill press, or you will have to punch a hole. Now, we've talked about making punches and chisels in several previous videos. This is not a new subject, but in every case I cut the material to length and I hold it in a pair of tongs while I make the punch and while I harden and temper the punch. If you don't have a pair of tongs yet and you haven't learned to make tongs, how do you make the punch to put the hole in the tongs to make the tongs? That's one of those things that gets tough. Now, if you can go to somebody else's shop and make some of your first tools using their tools, that helps quite a bit. But if you don't have that option, one option is to just start with a long piece of steel suitable for your punch. W1, O1 are probably pretty good steels to start with. If you can find a long straight section, somebody's already straightened out some coil spring, you can use coil spring. Sucker rod is straight and makes a great punch. Sucker rod's liable to come in a 10 or 12 foot piece though, so you're going to have to be able to cut that. Being able to cut material is something I have to assume you've got figured out or have some way to get somebody else to cut it. So instead of cutting this and then holding it in a pair of tongs to forge it, forge the end of the punch first. Then cut this with, let it anneal, and cut it with a hacksaw or cut it with an angle grinder with a cut-off disc in it. That's a very effective way, and even if this material is not fully annealed, you can do that with this cut-off disc, and a hacksaw is going to wear out if you don't get all of the hardness out of this when you're annealing it, and that can be sometimes hard in a small shop. So by doing that, you can actually forge, shape the punch, get it dressed up, harden it on the end of this. You don't need to harden the area you're going to cut, and then cut it off. And that way you can make a punch that will then be available for you to punch the hole in your tong halves, so you can make a pair of tongs, and you can do the whole process without having a pair of tongs to start with. Suppose at some point we may have to do a video that really does start with nothing but forge, hammer, anvil, and let's figure out what tool to make first and what tool to make second instead of jumping around. But right now we're going to go and talk about tongs anyways. Make a punch if you need one. If you have a hand drill, you can drill a hole in tongs. It'll just take a little longer. Drill press is great. Punched or drilled, either way, that works. Now there are lots of different tongs out there that you can buy. You may not have to make your first set of tongs, but they can be expensive. A pair like this probably runs you close to $50, and by the time you pay shipping it might be a little bit more. And if you only need one pair of tongs to get a certain job done, it might be worth investing in a pair of store-bought tongs. If nothing else, it gives you an idea of proportions and ratios and the construction details that you need for the tongs you're going to make. But I understand that a lot of people can't afford to pay $50 for a pair of tongs, or they recognize they're going to need a half dozen pairs pretty quickly, and you certainly can't pay $300 for tongs. But some of these store-bought tongs really are quite nice. They're very usable, and if you have more money than time, it's not a bad way to go. If you have more time than money, making tongs is the way to go. You can also buy antique tongs. The problem with the antiques is most of them are quite heavy because our ancestors were doing bigger work than we are in many cases, and they were made out of wrought iron, which was weaker, so it had to be a heavier section of material to be able to make these. And they're oftentimes not in very good shape. These have been kind of burned, and it's an odd size. And you can reforge the old tongs. You can heat this up and make them into something else if you need to. But that's such a heavy pair of tongs, I don't find them pleasant to use unless I have to. These look similar in size, but this pair of off-center tongs is probably about half the weight of this old pair of hand-forged tongs. So that brings us to what kind of tongs can you make? Now these are all tongs that I have made for one purpose or another. And there are lots of different ways you can go about making tongs. And we will discuss different methods and different styles of tongs in more detail as we get deeper into tong making. And then we will cross over the tong making in our forge welding series to weld the reins on the tongs onto the jaw of the tongs. Being able to make this forge weld will save you lots of time in making tongs. But part of the problem is this is a small piece and you need tongs to hold this and bring it out of the fire so you can weld the rein onto it. So it's another place you have to have tongs to make tongs if you're using this method. But we will cover this as part of the forge welding series and let the forge welding and the tong series of videos cross over and kind of work together for each other. For right now though, what I'm going to do is present a simple no tong pair of flat jaw tongs. This is as basic a pair of tongs as you can make. Very simple, but very functional. There's absolutely nothing wrong with these tongs. They're not a make-do, make-shift, get by with as little as you can sort of tongs. These are going to be a very handy pair of tongs. These are made out of flat bar. This little pair of tongs was made out of 1/4 inch by 1 inch stock. Now that's what I have here. Now my preference, quite honestly, would be to have 2-foot lengths so I can have a nice handle to hold on to since I don't have tongs. This is about 14 inches long and it's the last of the 1/4 by 1 stock I have in the shop. And because I'm going to do this in the coal fire, I can keep this in cool enough while I work on it. So we're going to go ahead and use it. Now I want to set off 4 inches to make my tong rein out of. This is the rein, like the reins of a horse. It's the part you hold on to control what you're doing. This is the bit. This area is the boss, the round area where the rivet goes through. And the reins on this pair of tongs is made out of 4 inches of 1/4 inch by 1 inch flat bar. And I'm going to put a little mark in there so I can find it, and we'll do that over at the anvil. And then this section, the boss, is 1 inch of material. So I need another inch here to make the boss out of. And I'm laying out 1 on each end of this. And then this will become the jaw of the tong. Now the jaws on this one are about 1.5 inches, but these are drawn out a little bit as we forge this. They're going to get a little longer. You can probably get by with 1 inch of material, but you might be happier to have a little bit too much and then trim it, file it, saw it, hacksaw, grind, whatever you got to do to get everything the size you want it afterwards. So I'm going to actually lay this out as 1.5 inches for my allowance. And so our little short piece of bar has enough for the entire pair of tongs, and this little bit in the middle is going to be scrap. That's all we're going to waste out of this. So again, I would rather have two pieces, 18 inches, 2 feet long, so I can hold on to this end while I work on this end and do 1/2 on each end so I can compare them continuously as I forge them. But because of poor prior planning on my part, this is all the 1/4 by 1 I've got. Now you can make this out of 1/4 by 1 1/4, and you'll end up with a little bigger, a little heavier pair of tongs, and that's okay. You could make them out of 5/16 or 3/8 by 1 and end up with a heavier duty pair of tongs. But I think for the first pair we do, we want to keep it more reasonable. And if you want a real light duty pair of tongs, you could go 1/4 by 3/4. But that's going to be a very light duty pair of tongs. Is lay out or mark so we can find it hot where all of our points are going to be. An ideal way to do this is with a hardy at the anvil. But if you don't have a hardy, you might be able to find some way to hold this or stand it up on edge. Kind of prop the heel of your hand up there and do this with a chisel. This is a lot weirder and a lot harder than the hardy would be. But since we're assuming that this is a project for those without a lot of tools, this might be an option. So that does give me a pretty good mark. Another way we might be able to do this is with just a piece of round bar set on the anvil. Now the round bar is just as soft as this bar, so it's not going to be the best mark, but it does leave it a little bit of a dent that I think I can find. And you're marking opposites. On this one we're on one side of the boss because the reins are going to come out here, but the jaw is going to be over here, so we're marking it on the other side, on this side. So hopefully we can see those marks. And we'll come back hot and we'll deepen them. And then this piece of round bar will work just fine on the hot material. Now because I'm working with such a short bar, this handle end is going to get hot. Even though I'm going to be able to use it for several heats, I'm going to have to cool it frequently. Now typically I would just grab that with the other end with a pair of tongs, and I would just quench them in the quench bucket there. But since we're doing this without tongs, you're going to have some other way to hold it. You can use a pair of channel locks. You can use a pair of pliers, just so long as you can get a grip. You can use vice grips. You can probably even use a welding magnet and stick it on there and quench it. Just whatever it takes to get a hold of it. If you've got absolutely no way to hold on to this and you're stuck with a bar this short, again, if this bar is 2 feet long, this wouldn't be an issue. But if there's nothing else you can do, just set it aside, go have a cup of coffee, it'll cool naturally. Or quench your whole hand in the bucket. Quench it down like this, leaving the hot end out. And as long as you're not too much ice in the bucket this time of year, you can get away with that. But whatever it takes to keep this cool enough to hold on to, since you don't have tongs to hold on to this end. Now this hot mill glove really makes this easier to hold on to and see what you're doing. You know, another way we can mark this is actually right here at the edge of the anvil. And if you have a kind of sharp corner on your anvil, you could probably do this cold and get some nice marks. But as I mentioned, this works pretty well. And that lets us know exactly where our transition points are going to be. And I've got nicks on either side where I'm going to cut it later. And that's really all the marking we need to do right now. So now we need to Need to draw this out. Well, I'm going to take this out fairly long and slim. The pair I'm using is a sample. Right up to the rivet is 12 inches. Right up to the boss is about 11.5 inches. So we've got 4 inches of material. We need to draw out to almost 12 inches. We're going to make that almost 3 times longer. When it gets down to this very end, it's going to be just under 1/4 of an inch. But up here, it's closer to 3/8 of an inch. Even though it's 1/4 inch bar, it's going to get wider as we make it skinnier, or thicker as we make it narrower, however you want to look at that. It's going to upset a little bit. So this is an exercise in drawing out as well as an exercise in tong making. I'm going to put that little notch right at the edge of the anvil, and with half-face blows start stepping down that transition between the boss and the reins. And we're just defining what we want here at this point. And for the most part, I let things get thicker. I don't want to let it bulge out and mushroom over. But if it gets thicker in this dimension, that's okay, because that's going to add strength and it's going to make a better pair of tongs. We're assuming you have minimal tools, so you need to draw this out at the anvil. Working over the horn will be faster than working over the face of the anvil. Not quite as clean and neat, but you can get a good start this way. Take good blows. This isn't a place to go tappity-tappity. And then get it hot again. Keeping this hot makes your work a lot easier. Working it cold is just miserable. A lot of people starting out have some kind of a make-do anvil that doesn't have a horn. Piece of railroad track or just a giant hunk of steel. And while the horn is faster, you can do this here. You can use the peen of the hammer and make very fast results. This is what the cross peen is for. I go 90 degrees and work all the way around the piece, so I'm not just chopping up one side, but when it's down against the anvil, the peen marks are being flattened out as I work the opposite side. Another thing that can help draw stuff out is working it right at the corner and doing these half-face blows and using the corner of the anvil like a peen. But I would recommend coming back to the face, no matter what you're doing, and cleaning this up from time to time to make sure you don't get little cold shuts and peen marks that are so deep that you'll never get rid of them. But we're making progress. Here's what we're after. We are, well, 3/4 of the way there, really. Another way you can spread material is with the corner of the hammer. If you've got a nice radius here and it's not too sharp, and just tip your hammer and use that corner. If you're working over here, you can do both at the same time and get top and bottom fullering. But that does leave fairly irregular surfaces, and you could go too far real easy, especially at this point. Now, because we're getting close, I want to go ahead and take this far end down to about 3/16 square, maybe a little bigger than that maybe, but something under 1/4. And then I want to round this up I'm just doing this in because I know what I want it to look like. Again, you go square, then octagon, and then round. Now the next thing I'll do is I'll make this end look the way I want it to. You see, we're still getting pretty close here, but this can be a little thinner right there, I think, but about half the width of the boss, or maybe a little less. And then I'll blend in between and make a nice graceful taper between what I know I want here and what I know I want there, and hopefully when I'm done we will have picked up our last 2 inches for the reins. So there's a little less brute force here and considerably more finesse at this point. You want to keep this nice square cross section, or square cornered. It can be rectangular. It can be a little bit wider here than it is thick in this dimension. But when we're all done, I'm going to leave this area square cornered instead of round, and just round the part that we're going to hold on to. And that makes a slightly stronger pair of tongs. So we're still getting close. There's a lot of material here that could be drawn out, but this is pretty good here. That's pretty much what I want. So now it's just a matter of blending what I want here with what I like there, and that's mostly this lumpy area right in the middle there. And I think this is thin enough that I don't want to go back to the horn or do anything very aggressive for fear of creating a thinner spot that would bend easier. Now, there's nothing really magical about my measurements. They were somewhat arbitrary based on the first pair of these I made, and I liked that size rein, so that's what I'm trying to make here. If you want them a little bit longer, start with a little bit more material and make it a little bit longer. Now I'm working this cold not so much to forge it as to just kind of knock some of the high spots off and just smooth it up a little bit. At most we need another inch, and we're going to get some when we round this up. Now this section right through here, which is about 3.5 inches worth, I leave square, transition to a little bit of an octagon, and then round up the part that you're actually holding on to. So all I really want to do is just clean out any thick spots. And then go to octagon. And then take that octagon to a round shape. At this point you don't need very much heat, so don't get it extremely hot because that just makes it scale more, and you can knock the scale off at the lower heats. But we're getting very close. So all we're doing is cleaning up the round and trying to get as many little facets off of it as we can. It's not critical. You could just knock the corners off and leave it octagon if you want. It's kind of up to what you think is comfortable to hold. I'm going to knock the corners off this section that I am leaving more squarish But I'm not going to a full octagon up there. I just want to not have sharp corners. This is too cold. You might have to heat it up again. Let's see how close we are. We're within about 1/4 of an inch now. So that's not bad at all. And I would be perfectly happy to leave it that way, but I think I'll draw this out a little bit. So I'll go back to more or less square, draw it out, redo the octagon, redo the round. Just decide where it's a little bit heavier. And this is a fairly lightweight pair of tongs. This isn't something you're going to hold a 3 or 4 pound part with. As this comes around, you want to think about it being straight. It's pretty crooked now. The first bunches of tongs I ever made, I did not take this kind of time on the handle, and they were really quite ugly. And they worked. You can get by with ugly tongs, but later you'll be glad you took the time to round this up nice. And you may even want to take a file or some sandpaper to it to make sure that it's good and comfortable. Although if it's too smooth, it might be slippery. So that's pretty much right on our sample piece here. So we're going to leave that in. Now what we've done here is we have created a handle, once it cools, that I can turn around, I can hold on to while I work the other half of the tongs. You could do this in 2 separate bars, and if they're long enough to be well away from the heat, that will actually be much easier than this. But that is all you're after right now. So now we're going to do the same thing, but now I've got a longer handle to hold on to, so this should be more comfortable in the long run. I need to find my initial marks and make them much more obvious. This is just like we did the first time. Now it doesn't matter if your reins end up on the same side of this bar or on opposite sides, because we're going to cut this off late after we're done to make the actual tongs. So this is just holding everything so you can manage it without needing a pair of tongs to start with. I also think I'm not going to talk too much during this one, so we can probably fast forward this. It looks just like doing this one. All of the lecture is the same. I'm just going to get it done, but we're going to do it by hand and not with a power hammer, and that way you can see that it is possible. And even I can do it. So that's pretty much the two reins. They are still connected. We have not used any tongs. We used a pair of pliers to hold this onto to quench it, but that's as close to a pair of tongs as we came. Now we are going to cut this off. We made these notches here to tell us where to cut it, and we're going to cut that off next after this cools a little bit. And this section will become the jaws of the tong, and we'll talk about how we're going to create that. But this is the part you usually need a pair of tongs for, is to create the reins, either because you're forge welding and you have to bring that short piece out of the fire to join at the anvil, or because you've pre-cut all your material, and that works pretty well if you're making a bunch and you've got tongs to hold it in, because then it's easy to compare each piece and make sure they all end up the same. But if you don't have tongs, this is the way you do it. Just leave it long and then go cut it. So how are we going to cut this? It doesn't matter. This does not care. Use a shear. If you've got a heavy shear, use a hot chisel and cut it right here at the anvil if you want to, hot. Use a hardy, if you've got a hardy, and cut it at the anvil. Use a cold chisel at the anvil. Use a hacksaw. Use an angle grinder. Use a chop saw. Use a bandsaw. It doesn't matter. All you're doing is cutting this off. And we've watched cutting things off quite often, so that I'm not going to show. I think we'll give you a little bit of a break right here. This is going to turn into a little over an hour video, so we'll pick this up again in the next one. In the meantime, I hope you liked the video. Get out to your shop and you can start making tongs.